are the Borg. Lower your shields and surrender your ships. We will add your biological and technological distinctiveness to our own. Your culture will adapt to service us. Resistance is futile.
How you doing, guys? When I was growing up, I used to love science fictions. Kind of still do. One of my favorites was Star Trek. Basically, I liked Star Trek because it had a very positive outlook for the future. At the time, we had quite an array of them that had a very pessimistic outlook of the future. Although Star Trek did have its array of villains, every story needs some, the production company behind it did their homework. If you look at how many things that they actually had that have come to pass. We now have video discs. Holographic technology has come into play. And many of the items used in Star Trek are now passé. They had to do their homework again with the reboots in the 1980s because a lot of the gadgets, if you remember, their communicators resembled flip-top cell phones. So they went from having communicators to comm badges. It had taken me a couple of years to warm up to the new generation of Star Treks, but it did happen. I stopped looking at it as a replacement and just added an addition to the story. Funny thing was, the villains of old just didn't seem to be so threatening in the reboots. Basically, let's face it, every culture adapts and moves on. What was an enemy was now an ally. And the problem was, for a couple of years, was to find a new villain that would be as much of a threat as a series from the 1960s. It was in 1989 that the episode Q Who aired. And they had introduced a villain that to this day is probably the most fantastic villain that the Star Trek franchise had ever introduced, and that being the Borg. Now, if anybody remembers this particular episode, the Enterprise was hurled light years off course, further than any starship had gone up until that point where they had encountered the Borg cube. Now, for a couple of years, not a whole lot was known about the Borg, except that they were both biological and part cybernetic. The only thing you found out within the first few years was that they didn't attack conventionally. What they did was they would absorb entire cultures, assimilating them into their culture in their quest for perfection. They would take on their technology and add it to theirs. The thing about the Borg, as we found out, they had no individuality. They lived to serve the collective. They had no desires on their own. When they weren't being used, they just sat in alcoves, waiting to be called on again. They didn't have their own thoughts. No individuality whatsoever. They lived entirely to serve the collective. It's funny how many cultures like that exist on this planet today, socialistic-wise. Individuality does not come into play. You live for the government. And you know, the funny thing is, I'm seeing so many young people now that are pushing for socialism when we spend our whole lives fighting against it. But one thing they're not realizing is you're giving up your individuality. You're giving up your freedom. Now, granted, the Borg from Star Trek were fictitious. Everything in Star Trek was fictitious, but if you watch real close, and if you listen to the message of what they're conveying, it's not too far-fetched. The one thing society has been trying to do was to coerce the pop masses to give up their individuality for those at the top. Religions are obviously no different, because when a lot of people make the analogy between Jehovah's Witnesses and the Borg, and there's a reason why. A lot of you JWs probably don't understand it. When I came in, I didn't realize what this was going to cost me, because I never had any intention of giving up my individuality. If you remember your first time in the Kingdom Hall, they start chipping away at it. Everything you do is for the organization. Nobody has any individuality there. I had worked with one of Jehovah's Witnesses. This is going back to 2010. I was still relatively new in the organization, but the one thing that annoyed me to no end was when you were talking to one of them, it didn't matter who you were talking to, the responses were virtually the same. The reactions were virtually the same. It was like talking to one and the same person, all belonging to this collective. Well, I was a little PO'd one morning in work, and this JW I worked with was very, very annoying. She was a typical JW, no individuality, very, very bitter, and spoke like your typical Jehovah's Witness. One day, I said to her, I really don't like conversing with Jehovah's Witnesses because they have all one and the same personality. And she said to me, oh no, there are many different personalities at the hall. I started thinking, that sounded so much like an Awake article. And actually it was. And why do you suppose Watchtower had to have an article like that in the Awake magazine, that there are many different personalities at the Kingdom Hall? Because I was not the only one that noticed. Many people noticed it. So Watchtower, even back then, had to do damage control and instill into the rank and file that, yes, you all have different personalities, when for the most part they did not. Their reactions were the same. I heard one YouTuber recently, actually didn't hear it, just saw the title, that Jehovah's Witnesses are collectively a prophet. And how can you be a prophet when you're basically not prophesying? The term collectively a prophet doesn't even exist. But to say Jehovah's Witnesses are the only one that are preaching is totally wrong. Their outlook for the future is nothing that nobody else is thinking of. I had no religious beliefs growing up. I really didn't. But even back then, 40 years in the past, we realized that something was coming down. There would be pandemics. There would be war. We knew this. We didn't need a religion to tell us this. Jehovah's Witnesses actually never, when they did their door-to-door work, never preached the good news because it was all about indoctrination to them. The thing is, preaching the good news will be one thing, but when you're adding on your own twist to indoctrinate others to come in, that's not preaching the good news. And what Jehovah's Witnesses do is not prophesying. They get their information from corporate headquarters in Warwick, New York, repeating what's already said in the Bible. Repeating what's in the Bible is one thing. Anybody can do that. Jehovah's Witnesses are not a prophet, collectively or individually. So really, are Jehovah's Witnesses collectively a prophet, or do they belong to the Borg collective? Anyways, guys, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I will talk to you soon. You guys have a good day.